It was 11 p.m. on May 1st, 1967, and Elvis Presley sat alone in his suite at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas, staring at a set of car keys on the dresser. In 9 hours, he was supposed to walk down the aisle and marry Priscilla Beaulieu, the beautiful young woman he'd been dating for 7 years, the woman he'd promised his future to, the woman who was sleeping in the room next door, dreaming of tomorrow's ceremony. But Elvis wasn't dreaming. Elvis was panicking. His hands were shaking. His heart was racing. And those car keys on the dresser were calling to him, whispering an escape route. All he had to do was pick them up, walk out the door, get in his car, and drive. Drive anywhere but here. Drive away from the wedding, the commitment, the trap he felt closing around him. Nobody would know until morning. By then, he'd be gone. This is the story of the longest night of Elvis Presley's life. The night he almost ran away. The night he almost destroyed everything. The night that would define the rest of his marriage before it even began. The evening had started innocently enough. There had been a small gathering in the hotel. Elvis, Priscilla, their immediate families, and Colonel Parker going over last-minute details. The wedding would be private, intimate. Just 14 people. No press until after the ceremony. Then a quick press conference. Everything controlled. Everything managed. Everything exactly how Colonel Parker wanted it. Which was part of the problem. Elvis had wanted to get married at Graceland, in Memphis, in his home. He'd wanted his friends there, his guys, the people who'd been with him through everything. But Colonel Parker had other ideas. Las Vegas. Quick ceremony. Maximum publicity value. Minimal cost. And because Elvis had learned over the years that arguing with the Colonel was exhausting and usually futile, he'd agreed. Just like he always agreed. Just like he'd been agreeing to things he didn't want for years. Priscilla had gone to bed around 10 p.m., excited and happy, unaware of the storm brewing in her fiancé's mind. "I love you," she'd whispered, kissing him goodnight. "I can't wait to be your wife." And Elvis had smiled and said, "I love you too," and watched her walk back to her room, and felt his chest tighten with something that felt like love, but also felt like drowning. Now, alone in his suite, Elvis poured himself another glass of whiskey, his third in the past hour, and tried to understand what was happening to him. This was supposed to be one of the happiest nights of his life. Tomorrow he was marrying a woman he loved, a woman who'd waited for him patiently while he made movies and went on tour, a woman who'd moved to Memphis to be near him, who'd molded her life around his impossible schedule, who'd accepted his terms, his boundaries, his need for space. Priscilla was beautiful, intelligent, devoted. Any man would be lucky to marry her. So why did Elvis feel like he was walking into a prison? He picked up the car keys, feeling their weight in his palm. His Cadillac was parked in the hotel garage. He could be in the car in 5 minutes. On the highway in 10? In California by dawn. Or Arizona, or Mexico. Anywhere but here. His mind raced through the logistics. He'd leave a note. Something apologetic but vague. "I'm sorry. I can't do this. It's not you, it's me." The oldest line in the book, but in this case it was true. It wasn't Priscilla's fault. She'd done everything right. She'd been patient and devoted and loving. The problem was him. It had always been him. The phone on the nightstand rang, making him jump. He stared at it for 4 rings before picking up. "Yeah? Elvis, it's Joe." Joe Esposito, one of his closest friends and part of the Memphis Mafia, the group of guys who worked for Elvis and traveled with him everywhere. "You okay, man? You sound weird." "I'm fine. Just tired." "You sure? Because Red said you looked pretty shaken up earlier. Said you barely said 2 words at dinner." Elvis closed his eyes. Of course his friends had noticed. They always noticed. "I'm just nervous about tomorrow." "That's normal, right? Groom jitters?" There was a pause on the other end. "Yeah, that's normal." "But Elvis, you know you don't have to do this if you don't want to, right? If you're having doubts—" "I'm not having doubts," Elvis said quickly. Too quickly. "I love Priscilla. I want to marry her." Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure." You know we all support you, whatever you decide." After he hung up, Elvis realized his hands were still shaking. He looked at the clock. 11:30 p.m. 8.5 hours until the wedding. He could still leave. He could still walk away. But here's the shocking part. This wasn't the first time Elvis had thought about running. He'd been having these thoughts for weeks. Every time someone mentioned the wedding, every time Priscilla talked about their future together, every time he looked at the calendar and saw May 1st circled in red, he felt the walls closing in. And the closer the date came, the stronger the urge to flee became. Elvis walked to the window and looked out at the Las Vegas Strip, all neon and noise and artificial light. He'd performed in Vegas countless times. He knew this city well. It was a city built on illusions, on pretending, on giving people what they wanted to see rather than what was real. Maybe that's why Colonel Parker had chosen it for the wedding, because Elvis's whole life had become an illusion. The movies were illusions. The carefully managed public image was an illusion. And maybe, Elvis thought, his relationship with Priscilla was an illusion too. He loved her. He did. But did he love her the way a husband should love a wife? Or did he love her the way someone loves a beautiful object they've collected? Priscilla had been so young when they met, only 14. Elvis had been 24, stationed in Germany with the army. She'd looked up to him like he was a god. And maybe, if Elvis was being honest with himself, that's what he'd liked about her. She worshipped him. She didn't challenge him. She became whatever he wanted her to be. But was that love? Or was it something else? Something more selfish? Elvis thought about Dixie Locke, his first girlfriend, who'd walked away from him when fame started to change him. She'd seen what was coming and had the courage to leave. He thought about Anita Wood, who'd wanted to marry him in the early 60s, but Elvis had kept making excuses, kept postponing, until she finally gave up and moved on. He thought about Anne Margaret, his co-star in Viva Las Vegas, who'd been so full of fire and independence that it both attracted and terrified him. All these women who'd had their own lives, their own dreams, their own identities separate from him. Priscilla didn't have that. Priscilla had been Elvis's project. He'd shaped her, molded her, turned her into his ideal woman. She dressed how he wanted, wore her hair how he wanted, acted how he wanted, and tomorrow she would become legally his wife, his possession. The thought made him sick. This is where everything changed, because at 12:30 a.m., Elvis made a decision. He picked up the car keys, grabbed his jacket, and walked toward the door. He was leaving. He was actually doing it. He'd drive to California, check into a hotel under a fake name, and figure things out. He'd call Priscilla in the morning, apologize, try to explain. She'd hate him, but maybe that was better than marrying her under false pretenses. Maybe that was kinder in the long run. His hand was on the doorknob when there was a soft knock. Elvis froze. Through the door, he heard Priscilla's voice, quiet and hesitant. "Elvis, are you awake?" For a long moment, he didn't move, didn't breathe. If he stayed silent, she might think he was asleep and go away, and then he could leave. But something made him open the door. Priscilla stood there in a white nightgown, her long dark hair loose around her shoulders. She looked so young, so vulnerable. And when she saw his face, saw whatever desperate expression he was wearing, her eyes filled with concern. "What's wrong?" she asked. "You look awful." "Nothing's wrong. I just couldn't sleep." She looked past him into the room, saw the glass of whiskey, the tension in his body. "Elvis, talk to me, please. If you're having second thoughts—" "I'm not," he said automatically. "Yes, you are. I can see it in your face. You've been distant for weeks. You barely touch me. You barely talk to me. And now, the night before our wedding, you look like you're about to have a panic attack." She took a step closer. "If you don't want to marry me, just say so. I'd rather know now than find out later that I trapped you into something you never wanted." Elvis stared at her, seeing something in her eyes he hadn't expected. Strength. For the first time in a long time, Priscilla wasn't looking at him with worship or adoration. She was looking at him with clarity, like she could see right through him. "I'm scared," he admitted finally, the words escaping before he could stop them. "I'm terrified, Scylla. Of marriage, of commitment, of failing you, of losing myself, of becoming someone I don't recognize." "You think I'm not scared too?" Priscilla asked, her voice stronger now. "I'm 21 years old. I've spent the last 7 years of my life waiting for you, being what you wanted me to be, putting my life on hold for yours. Tomorrow, I'm supposed to marry the most famous man in the world, and I have no idea what that's going to mean for me. If I'll disappear completely into being Mrs. Elvis Presley. If I'll ever be allowed to be just Priscilla again." Elvis looked at her, really looked at her, and saw someone he hadn't noticed before. Not the young girl who'd followed him from Germany, not the perfect doll he'd created, but a real woman with her own fears and doubts and needs. "Then why are we doing this?" he asked quietly. "Because despite everything, despite the fear and the doubt and the uncertainty, I love you. The real you, not Elvis Presley, the star, not the image or the fame or any of that. I love the man who stayed up all night with me talking about philosophy, the man who cried when his mother died, the man who believes in God and struggles with his purpose. That's who I'm marrying tomorrow. And if you can't love me the same way, the real me, not the version you've created, then, yeah, we shouldn't do this. You haven't seen the biggest surprise yet, because what happened next would determine not just whether the wedding happened, but the entire trajectory of their relationship for the next 6 years." Elvis put the car keys down on the table by the door. He took Priscilla's hand and led her into the room, closing the door behind them. They sat on the couch, and for the first time in months, they actually talked, really talked, about their fears, about their expectations, about what marriage meant to each of them, about whether they could make this work without losing themselves in the process. "I don't want to be your possession," Priscilla said. "I don't want to be a trophy wife who just looks pretty and does what she's told. I want to be your partner, your equal, someone you respect, not just someone you control." Elvis felt something shift in his chest. "I don't know if I know how to do that. I've been in control of everything for so long. My career, my image, my relationships. Letting go of that control feels like I'll disappear." "You won't disappear. You'll just be sharing your life instead of directing it like one of your movies. What if I'm bad at it? What if I fail at being a husband? Then we'll figure it out together. But Elvis, you have to want to try. You have to want this marriage, not just go through with it because you feel obligated or because Colonel Parker thinks it's good for your image." Elvis was quiet for a long time. He looked at Priscilla, really looked at her, and saw not the young girl he'd met in Germany, but a woman, a strong, clear-eyed woman who knew what she wanted and wasn't afraid to ask for it. When had that happened? When had she stopped being the girl who agreed with everything he said and become someone with her own voice? "What changed you?" he asked. "You used to never talk to me like this." "I grew up," Priscilla said simply. "You wanted me to stay that 14-year-old girl from Germany forever. But I couldn't. Nobody can stay frozen in time, Elvis. Not even for you." Elvis was quiet for a long time. He thought about the car keys on the table, about the escape route he'd planned, about how close he'd come to running. And then he thought about what he'd be running toward. More movies he hated, more empty relationships, more years of feeling disconnected from his own life. Running away had always been his pattern. When things got too real, too close, too vulnerable, he fled. Into work, into other women, into prescription drugs, into anything that kept him from having to face himself. "I do want this," he said finally, "but I'm going to mess it up sometimes. I'm going to be controlling and possessive and difficult. I'm going to disappoint you, I know, and I'm going to challenge you and frustrate you and not always be the perfect wife you imagined. We're both going to mess this up, but maybe that's okay. Maybe perfect isn't the point. Then what is the point? Elvis asked, genuinely wanting to know. Priscilla smiled softly. Showing up, trying, being honest even when it's hard. Choosing each other even when we're scared. She reached out and took his hand. You almost ran tonight, but you didn't. That means something. They talked until 3 a.m., sitting on that hotel couch, saying things they should have said years ago. It wasn't a magic conversation that solved all their problems. It wasn't a guarantee that the marriage would work. But it was honest. And for Elvis, who'd spent so many years living in carefully constructed illusions, honesty felt revolutionary. When Elvis finally woke at 7 a.m. after just 3 hours of sleep, his first thought was of the car keys. But they were still in the drawer where he'd put them. He hadn't dreamed about running. He'd slept for the first time in weeks, without nightmares. Maybe that meant something. Or maybe he was just too exhausted for his subconscious to torment him. Wait. Don't miss this crucial detail. At 3:30 a.m., Priscilla stood up to go back to her room so they could both get a few hours of sleep before the ceremony. At the door, she turned back to Elvis. If you change your mind between now and tomorrow, I'll understand. I won't hate you. I'd rather you be honest than pretend. Elvis walked over to her, took her face in his hands, and kissed her. Not the performative kisses he gave her for photos, but a real kiss. Honest, vulnerable. I'll be there, he said. I'll marry you tomorrow. And I'll try my best to be a real husband. Not just Elvis Presley playing the role of husband. After she left, Elvis picked up the car keys one more time. He held them for a moment, feeling their weight, feeling the pull of escape. Then he walked over to the dresser and put them in a drawer. He wouldn't need them tonight. What you're seeing now is nothing compared to what happened at the actual ceremony the next day. Because when Elvis stood at the altar at 9:41 a.m. on May 1st, 1967, watching Priscilla walk toward him in her white dress, he felt something he hadn't expected. Peace. Not certainty. Not confidence that everything would be perfect, but a sense that he'd made a choice, consciously and honestly, to try, to show up, to be present rather than run. The ceremony lasted 8 minutes. The vows were traditional. Priscilla became Mrs. Elvis Presley. They kissed. Everyone applauded. Colonel Parker immediately ushered them to a press conference where flashbulbs exploded and reporters shouted questions. The machinery of fame ground on, turning even this private moment into public spectacle. But in that moment, at the altar, before the chaos started, Elvis and Priscilla had looked at each other with understanding. They both knew how close they'd come to this not happening. They both knew the conversation they'd had in the middle of the night had changed something fundamental between them. Whether it would be enough to save the marriage remained to be seen. In the photographs from that day, if you look closely at Elvis's eyes, you can see something. Not the confident swagger of the king of rock and roll, not the movie star charm, but something more vulnerable. Relief, maybe, or gratitude, or the look of someone who almost ran away but found the courage to stay. Priscilla, in her white dress with her dark hair and radiant smile, looks like any other beautiful bride. But those who knew her well said they could see something else, too. A quiet strength. The strength of someone who'd refused to let the man she loved disappear into his fear. You won't believe this, but the story of Elvis's almost escape on his wedding night stayed secret for years. None of his friends talked about it publicly. Priscilla didn't mention it in interviews. It was a private moment, a private crisis that only those directly involved knew about. But years later, after the divorce, after Elvis's death, the truth began to emerge. People who'd been there that night started sharing what they'd witnessed. The panic, the car keys, the 3 a.m. conversation that saved the wedding. And when the full story came out, it revealed something important about Elvis Presley that contradicted his public image. The world saw him as supremely confident, always in control, the king who commanded everything around him. But privately, he was filled with doubt and fear, afraid of commitment, Afraid of vulnerability? Afraid of being trapped in a role he couldn't escape? Hold on. This is when it gets real. Because the marriage that almost didn't happen lasted 6 years. 6 complicated, difficult, ultimately doomed years. And in retrospect, maybe the warning signs were all there on that wedding night. Maybe Elvis's instinct to run had been right. Maybe they should have called it off and saved themselves years of pain. But maybe not. Because those 6 years, flawed as they were, produced Lisa Marie Presley. They produced moments of genuine connection and love amid the chaos. They produced growth, even if it was painful growth. And they proved that Elvis was capable of trying, of showing up, of fighting his instinct to flee even when staying was hard. Priscilla would later say that the Elvis who stood at the altar on May 1st, 1967, was different from the Elvis she'd known before. More present, more honest, more willing to be vulnerable. It didn't last. The pressures of fame, Elvis's addiction to prescription drugs, his need for control, and his infidelities would eventually destroy the marriage. But for those first few months after the wedding, there was real partnership, real effort, real presence. The tragedy of Elvis and Priscilla's marriage isn't that Elvis almost ran away the night before the wedding. The tragedy is that he did run away eventually, just years later and in different ways. He ran into prescription drugs. He ran into affairs with other women. He ran into the same patterns of control and possession that he'd promised to avoid. The car keys he'd put in the drawer that night were just waiting to be picked up again later. But here's the truth. That moment of almost running, that 3 a.m. conversation, that choice to stay, it mattered. It showed that Elvis was capable of confronting his fears, of being honest about his limitations, of trying to be better than his worst instincts. He didn't always succeed. He failed more than he succeeded. But he tried. And maybe that's all anyone can do. Years after Elvis's death, someone asked Priscilla if she regretted marrying him, if she wished she'd known that night that the marriage would end in divorce, that Elvis would never fully overcome his need for control, that the patterns established in their relationship would repeat until they became unbearable. Priscilla was quiet for a moment before answering. "I don't regret it. We both went into that marriage with our eyes open. We both knew it would be hard. We both knew Elvis was struggling with things he couldn't fully control. But we loved each other. Imperfectly. Incompletely. But genuinely. And that love created Lisa Marie. So, no, I don't regret it. I just wish Elvis had been able to keep choosing to stay, the way he chose to stay that night." The story of Elvis's pre-wedding panic is the story of a man trapped between who he wanted to be and who he'd become. Between the authentic self that craved real connection and the constructed celebrity that needed control. Between love and fear. Between staying and running. And in that moment, in that Las Vegas hotel suite at midnight, he chose to stay. He chose to try. He chose to be honest about his fear rather than let it control him. It's a more complicated, more human story than the fairy tale version of Elvis's wedding that was sold to the public. There were no paparazzi shots of the groom's midnight crisis. No press releases about cold feet and 3 a.m. conversations. The world saw the 8-minute ceremony, the beautiful bride, the happy groom, the perfect celebrity wedding. They didn't see the car keys on the dresser, or the shaking hands, or the tears. But that's the real story. The human story. The story of someone facing their worst fears and choosing to show up anyway, even knowing they might fail, even knowing the relationship might not last, even knowing they weren't the perfect partner they wished they could be. That's what courage looks like. Not the absence of fear, but moving forward despite it. Not running away, but putting the car keys in the drawer and trying. Not pretending to be perfect, but admitting your flaws and showing up anyway. Elvis and Priscilla divorced in 1973. By then, the patterns established on their wedding night had played out to their inevitable conclusion. Elvis couldn't let go of control. Priscilla couldn't stay in a relationship where she was possessed, rather than partnered. The love was still there, but love wasn't enough to overcome the fundamental incompatibilities in how they related to each other. But on May 1st, 1967, at 9:41 a.m., when Elvis said, "I do," he meant it. Despite the panic, despite the doubts, despite having been moments away from running, he stood at that altar and chose Priscilla, chose commitment, chose to try to be the husband he'd promised to be in their 3 a.m. conversation. That he ultimately couldn't sustain that choice doesn't negate the fact that he made it. That the marriage eventually failed doesn't mean it was a mistake to try. That Elvis struggled with commitment his entire life doesn't mean the moment he chose to stay wasn't meaningful and brave. This is the legacy of the night Elvis almost didn't marry Priscilla. Not that he almost ran away, but that he stayed. Not that he was perfect, but that he was honest about his imperfection. Not that the marriage lasted forever, but that he showed up when every instinct told him to flee. And maybe that's the most human thing about Elvis Presley. Not the superhuman talent or the legendary status or the iconic image, but the fact that he felt the same fears, doubts, and panic that anyone feels when facing major life commitments. The fact that he wanted to run away and almost did. The fact that he chose to stay anyway. Because that's what love requires. Not the absence of doubt, but the willingness to stay despite it. Not perfect certainty, but imperfect courage. Not running from fear, but walking toward commitment even with shaking hands. On the night before his wedding, Elvis Presley held car keys in his hand and felt the pull of escape. And then he put them down. He stayed. He tried. And for one night at least, that was enough. Which city are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. Now we want to hear from you. Have you ever had cold feet before a major commitment? Do you think Elvis should have run that night? Can a marriage survive when it almost didn't happen? What would you have done in his situation? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of Elvis Presley, the real moments behind the legend and the human side of fame. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next story about the king of rock and roll.